My journey through the vast landscape of moving pictures is marked not only by highs and lows of the art itself, but also by people I meet along the way. From the people directly involved with making movies, directors, producers, actors, to movie experts and critics, to movie buffs and collectors, to zine makers and magazine publishers, to video distributors. Every single of those influenced me in one way or another, and it goes without saying, I am extremely grateful for the knowledge, expertise, information, and the sheer fun their work brings to me. Some of those folks are well known, some are less known, but mostly because I haven't had the chance to discover them yet. One of such people we're gonna meet together today. Let's meet Michael J. Bowen, the movie historian, the writer, or author if you will, and the researcher. He is the biographer of the two important sexploitation legends, Doris Wishman and Joe Sarno. All of these, and I'm sure Michael himself, are quite well known in the English-speaking world of movie lovers. I'm certain that there are not so many people in my home country of Slovakia who know about them. So, as I've said, let's meet Michael and see what he has to say about his own journey in the cinema world. Welcome.
Hey, so thank you very much for this interview, which people don't know, but we got a real ordeal going through all the settings. So
No problem.
how are you these days? How are you doing, and what
I'm
keeps you
doing
busy?
fine, thank you. I'm keeping very busy with a few projects, but I'm still very much involved with researching adult films, sexploitation movies, that kind of stuff.
And for those people watching or listening to our discussion who don't have slightest clue who you might be, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Michael Bowen. I'm an independent film historian, although I have an academic background. And I've been focusing on low-budget films made in New York specifically for about 30 years now. But within the context of that low-budget New York filmmaking, I've done an awful lot of work on the history of so-called sexploitation movies from the 1960s, and then even what we call hardcore porn films from the 1970s. And New York was a very important center for the production of those films at that time. So it's the right place to look at them.
Okay, this video is preceded by my short introduction. So I introduce you as a film historian and a writer and author and researcher, but obviously nobody is born that way apart from maybe Lady Gaga, but that's for another day. The question is, how did your journey into the kingdom of moving pictures start?
Sure. I was a kind of a movie buff as a kid. We use that expression, movie buff, someone who just loves to watch movies. And at a fairly early age, I got interested in various kinds of movies, not just the normal movies you would go see at the movie cinema. This would be like in the 1970s when I was a kid. Became interested in what we call European art films in the United States, films by great filmmakers made in Europe mostly in the 50s and 60s, and classic Hollywood films, silent movies, you know, the whole history of filmmaking.
Yeah.
And it was in the 1990s, after many years of wasting my time in dark movie theaters, that I began to discover low-budget sexploitation films, which were being released on videotape for the first time, really, at that time, mostly by a company called Something Weird Video.
Yep.
That's what made me specifically interested in these particular kind of films, but I have a very broad background. I guess I would also like to say that I reinforced my interest in movies by going to colleges and doing some graduate work, especially on cinema. But I wasn't inspired to study cinema because I was a college student. It was more of the reverse. Because I already had a strong background in cinema, I thought maybe I should go to college and get some credit for all of the work I had already done.
Yeah, that sounds like a good move. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what would you single out? What movies would you single out as the foundational films of your growing up?
It's a hard question because
It is.
I've always sort of, I dig into something, learn what I want to learn about it, and then I move on a lot of the time. That's
Well,
typical of my technique. So I mean, my earliest favorite films were Japanese science fiction movies, Godzilla,
oh
which
yeah, of course, yeah.
I think actually taught me a couple of interesting things about the cinema. But then on public television, where I lived, I was not living in a city. Where I grew up was more the country. But on public television, there was a program showing classic films, silent movies, foreign films, and for some
Mhm.
reason, those things intrigued me. Also, here in the States, very late at night, like at 1 o'clock in the morning, they would oftentimes show old Hollywood films, and I would see some unusual old movies there. So it's hard for me to single out any particular film. I mean, I remember watching La Strada by Federico Fellini on a public television network, and it had a profound effect on me because it was so different from all the regular movies that I had seen at that time on
Mhm.
TV and movie theaters. So that's something perhaps. And I probably have a roster of films that I truly love, but I don't know that it's worth listing them. I love all great cinema. It doesn't matter how much money was spent on it. It doesn't matter where it came from or what it was intended to do commercially. I like films that have that are very unique from a stylistic point of view. That's my
Yeah.
main interest. In other words, my interest in cinema is aesthetic,
Or style.
style oriented, not so much culture oriented. If I'm interested in a sex film, it's not because I'm interested in sex or the politics of sexuality. It's because I've found a sex film that does something very interesting on a stylistic level. So that's really my orientation. There are many people in the States particularly who are interested in movies as artifacts of the sociology of a culture,
Hmm.
but I'm interested in art as art and the process of making artworks. And
Yeah.
that's what turns me on. And I think I realized that pretty early on. The films that I liked were quite stylistically unique. You might, for your listeners who are familiar with, say the work of David Lynch, early work of David Lynch, you see Eraserhead and you know
Hmm.
you're seeing a movie that's not like any other film.
Yeah, well,
It's
that's true. Yeah.
right. It's very, very unique.
It's strange. Yeah.
And not just because it's gruesome or it deals with unusual subject matter, but just the very way the film is put together and the way it sounds, which is particularly true of Eraserhead. The way it sounds is not like any normal movie you've ever seen. Those are the kind of experiences that turn me on Rudolph and that interest me in a film.
Yeah. Uh, I always say, and I do mean it, that the pop culture of America. I use the term pop culture, but it's like all a company,
Yeah,
for the culture as it is, low culture, high culture, whatever, in America. And although it's demonized by many, it's a literal treasure trove of stuff to discover for me. And
yes.
from book genres, I couldn't believe some stuff, that it actually exists. And
Yeah.
the comics culture, movies, grindhouses, and drive-ins, wrestling, zines culture, magazine or amateur magazines,
Right.
obviously straight cars, action figures, to the music and the unimaginable memorabilia to spend one's fortune on. As a kid, what was your favorite pastime hobby?
Reading.
Apart from going to cinema, of course.
Yeah, well, again, as a kid, I had limited opportunities when I was really a kid to go to movie theaters. There was a movie theater in the town where I grew up, but it showed typical Hollywood release type
Hmm.
movies. I mean, I did go, but um, that I wouldn't say that was particularly formative uh,
Hmm.
in my experience. I was a big reader, which explains why I went into academia in some ways. Also a collector, and I am to this day a collector archivist. one of the reasons that I love, one of the reasons I'm passionate about film history is because I also like to collect and preserve artifacts of that history, and I work with subject matter that is oftentimes difficult to find documented in libraries or museums or major institutions. So I began collecting that stuff. So when I was a kid, I would collect stamps and coins and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, typical, yeah.
I bought comic books, but I like to buy them every month and then keep them in order in a box, you know, that kind of. Even with movies, I used to keep a list, particularly with regard to the Japanese science fiction movies I had seen, which were very popular on television when I was a kid.
Yeah.
There was a regular program in different parts of the country called Creature Feature, right? Where they would show,
yes.
Usually show Japanese science fiction films, which had a big impact, of course, in the States in the 50s and 60s. Certainly they were more popular in America than Kurosawa movies, you know. But I used to keep a careful list of every time I had seen Godzilla's Revenge, and I would mark down how many times I had seen it, and I would write the credits off the screen as they flashed on the television screen. You know, this was before videotape. There were very few good books. There was no internet, so you kind of put those things together. So that's how I wasted my youth. What I did not do particularly was play sports or learn to play a musical instrument. Yeah. And I probably regret that I didn't do those things a little bit more when I was younger.
Well, the question is, when you mentioned the Creature Feature program, did you have in your area so-called like a local horror show with the, you know, the horror house or something like that?
Yeah, we had
like a Svengoolie or, you know, Ghoul.
Yeah, we did. I grew up in the greater Boston area, the city Boston in Massachusetts, although I lived in the country north of that in a different state called New Hampshire. So we would get television, though, from Boston. We were close enough to get the major television from Boston. And there were a couple programs like that coming out of Boston, although my favorite horror show with a host, I think actually was originated in Ohio, the state called Ohio. And then we saw it in Boston. It was like syndication, they would sell it. So, and that was the Ghoul movie, not Ghoulardi, but a different guy called Ghoul, who wore dark sunglasses with one of the lenses missing and crazy clothes with sort of crazy buttons all over it. And he had a rubber frog as a sidekick called Froggy. It was a very silly, and he would do silly skits in between. Yeah. Before the commercial break. You know, because we would have a commercial every 20 minutes or something. And then he'd do silly stuff, which was strange if you think about it, because you're watching a scary horror movie and his whole thing was comedy. But I actually thought I really liked the Ghoul movie. So, and I was a Marvel Comics kid, for people who want to know. Not Superman, but Spider-Man.
I read the bits about the horror house, because there's nothing like that here. We never had that. We got a host for like a kids shows on Sunday, but nothing like that. So obviously I was interested in that. So I read the histories about, you know, Svengoolie, Ghoulardi, Zacherle, Ghoul, and people like that. So obviously it's to this very day they continue the tradition of that. I find it very fascinating, you know.
I've never looked into it enough to know exactly where that trend started. There was also
Vampira, probably.
Vampira, right, who's associated with Ed Wood.
Yeah.
She was on the West Coast. So I'm sure somebody knows that history very well. I happen not to. But it was mostly a thing that local television networks, you know, in the United States, television, you have... television is regional in a sense. You have stations in different cities, and then they become affiliates of the major networks. Although that's also disappearing because of cable and the internet and everything, but it still exists. Yes. So what would happen is, like, one of the local stations in Boston would buy a package of movies, cheap horror movies.
Yes.
And then, as a way of promoting their program of cheap horror movies and enticing kids to watch it, they would hire somebody locally to be the host of those shows. That was a typical format. So I saw The Ghoul, but I think it's because we sort of lacked an equally entertaining local version. I remember there was something called Chiller Theater, and there was an announcer, but you only heard his voice. You didn't actually see him, and he had a sort of a scary voice, but
I'm trying to recall who was in Chiller Theater, but I probably won't because I'm not that skilled in that area.
It's not. You may know more about it than I do, Rudolph, and that's an area that I haven't revisited to really learn about. But it's interesting.
Yeah, I just recall Dr. Paul Bearer. That was one of them.
Could be. I'm not familiar.
Yeah. So I think it was in Florida, but I'm not sure. So I'm just don't take my word as gospel.
Right. It was very very regional, and the Ghoul I know originated from some city in Ohio because he made jokes about Ohio all the time, and I think I did read a little about it later. And the only reason I know him is because, again, I think because for whatever reason the local Boston channels didn't contrive a show that was as interesting as Ghoul's, so they just bought his show.
Nice one. Well, that's a smart move. I have a next question. I have to say, well, nowadays it's quite different, but back in the day, I was quite surprised by two things. First, that the sex films as a whole do have their own stories and histories, that there are real people with the real names behind them and their interesting life stories as well.
Yes.
And second, that there are people appreciating those movies and those people's finding value in them, although the majority of the so-called normal society doesn't. As for yourself, when did you get exposed to the sex films as genre? And do you remember what movie was your gate into the sexploitation and adult video world?
Yeah, they're two separate questions because
yes,
there are pornographic hardcore sex films, right, which were, when I was a teenager, that those films were in circulation.
Yes.
See, the 60s sexploitation almost disappeared, so I had to discover those much later, even though they were made earlier. But
yes.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, videotape was just becoming available.
Yes.
So I was raised, when I was a kid, it was just television and no videotape. And then when videotape came along, most people probably know that pornography helped to drive the videotape industry. Videotape players were very expensive. The tapes were very expensive. But the first people to invest in them were people who wanted to take porn and bring it home. They didn't want to go watch it in a porno movie theater anymore. So I think one of my friends in high school came across a copy of Debbie Does Dallas.
Oh, the famous one, yeah.
A famous porno movie shot in New York. In fact, some of the scenes were shot at a college in Brooklyn. And I remember seeing that, and that's probably the first time I had seen a pornographic film sitting around with 4 or 5 friends at somebody's house when their parents weren't home one night. And there was also a pornographic, believe it or not, a drive-in. There were still drive-ins around when I was a kid, although it was really already pretty much passé and over by that time. But this drive-in that probably could not figure out how to make money anymore was showing pornographic films, and they could do it because the drive-in was not close to any major road, so you couldn't see the giant drive-in screen if you were driving by on the highway. So a couple of friends and I, they used to have ads in the newspaper. You could see it was there. I don't know if they told you what the names of the movies were even, but we were adventurous enough to go there one night. I remember that the place was run by old women. When you pay to get in with your car, they would stop to pay, and then there was a concession stand where you could buy popcorn and hot dogs and stuff. Yeah. Everybody who worked there was an old lady. And when we drove up to pay, the woman looked in the car and she said, it was dark, getting to be dark. Are you kids all 18? We were probably 16, said, yes, we are. So, but that was my limited exposure to pornographic or adult films where I lived. There was very little access to them. Mm-hmm. And I honestly did not become particularly interested in so-called hardcore films until after I then discovered sexploitation movies. So this would be in
Yes.
the 90s. I was really a fan of sexploitation, which I discovered on videotape. And there was only originally one video. I was living in the Boston area by that time. I had been in and out of college a few times, was living in the Boston area in a city, and I found a store. It was really a record store that was more oriented toward like new music, punk rock, that kind of stuff. And they had a video section, and they began to stock Something Weird videos. And I was like, oh, what are these? I never heard of these movies before. And I rented a bunch of them and took them home, and I've been addicted ever since, because they're quite an interesting artifact of American culture that to this day, most Americans don't even know that genre exists.
Yeah, I would agree, yeah.
Yeah, not even Americans know about it. So, it really became, and it isn't because it was so invisible in the 60s. It's more that it just disappeared once porno became normal. Hardcore films that really showed sex, which is not sexploitation. Once porno came in, everybody forgot about the sexploitation films, and it took about 25 years for them to be resurrected on videotape. So that's how I discovered them.
For everybody who's not familiar with Something Weird video, there's this famous blue book. So
yeah, that actually contains their porno. The blue book contains porno films, and they have another catalog that contained all the exploitation and sexploitation, that stuff that wasn't pornographic. But given the fact that they were major film collectors, they were constantly finding, especially 16 millimeter prints of 70s porno movies, many of which are interesting films, by the way. There are very low budget, interesting movies, some of them.
Yeah, anytime I'm browsing, because I have this one of the I think the first Something Weird video catalog in PDF. Anytime I'm browsing, I'm just lamenting I'm not rich, because I would probably want everything they have to offer.
Yeah. Oh yes,
they're just amazing.
The name of the man who started the company was Mike Franey. He died several years ago of cancer at a young age. I think I'm older now than he was at the time.
He was 57 or 58.
What's that?
I think he was 57 or 58 when he died.
Yeah. So I'm older than he was, so I have some sense of how young that was. People listening to this who are in their 20s might think we're old, but when you get to be my age, you don't feel old. So he was a young man, but he deserves tremendous credit for the effort he made to find these films and then to transfer them and then to market them in a way that made them interesting and accessible to people. So Mike Franey deserves a great deal of credit for that. And his wife and his surviving partner, Lisa Petrucci, is still extremely involved in that world and is a wonderful, extremely knowledgeable person. So they did quite a service to people like me, but thousands and thousands of other people who wanted to discover all of these forgotten low-budget movies, many of which, as I've said, already, deserve to be recognized as interesting films because they really were.
Well, I would say that majority of people, or this, so I don't like the word, but I will use it, normies, if you will, they will never understand what profound effect on the not cinematic or the cinema collections or collector world, but what effect Mike Granny and Something Weird video have. They will never understand that, because for me, when I discovered that stuff, I was like, wow, it's just like being hit by the sledgehammer, because you were like something like that actually exists,
Oh yeah.
It's the underbelly of the cinematic world, which casual Netflix user will never see, unfortunately.
No, probably not. And I mean, there are good reasons for that. There are a million movies, and there are a lot of movies that are better positioned to compete for your attention. And then also, the majority of people have certain expectations of movies, normal expectations, which I don't criticize. I enjoy all sorts of regular dumb commercial movies myself, but it seems to be only a smaller group of people who get intrigued by these marginal films and who then have the desire to go searching for them and cataloging them and that kind of stuff. So it's a combination of interests that make these films accessible to people. Also, too, I think there's a culture of people who just like weird. They just like weird things. I'm not entirely sure that that's me, but they do make up a healthy percentage of the population of people.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
For example,
The fancy word for weird is transgressive. So
yeah.
some people who've done a little bit more reading in cultural theory or philosophy use the word transgressive, but it sort of amounts to an interest in what I'll call weird, kind of freakish, strange things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's my interest, although the things that interest me about movies are unusual. I wouldn't say that they're weird in the sense of being transgressive.
Yeah.
They might be stylistically unusual, but I'm not sure that they're meant to horrify anybody or in the case of sex to just turn you on.
Yeah. Okay, before we will have a break. This is like one of the movies from the Something Weird, which I just watched recently. I put the reviews on them. It was Thirsty Dead and the Swamp of the Ravens, and they are probably the type of movies we were talking about. They are not the greatest cinema, but they are still enticing and interesting to watch. So, but you have to be in that particular mood to be able to appreciate for what they are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know those films, so I can't comment on them. They could both be masterpieces, but I've noticed that there are certain people, for instance, who they just seem to like horror movie. I mean horror movies. I mean the gory slasher movies.
Splatter stuff, yeah.
Their fascination is with watching fake blood and fake guts. They'll watch any movie that does that, and they don't seem to know if it's a good movie or a bad movie.
Yeah.
My interest is in camera angles, in editing, and sound mixing, and music, all the things that make up a movie. And some horror movies do that in an interesting way, and some do it in a really shitty way. They all have blood and guts in them, but some of them are not particularly interesting as cinema.
Yeah. Okay, so let's have a break, and we'll come back after the break.